The moment Adelaide Rivers saw the man standing at the altar of the small wooden church in St. George, Utah, something felt wrong in the pit of her stomach, though she could not have explained why if her life had depended upon it. It was June of 1878, and the desert heat pressed against the walls of the modest building like an insistent hand, making the air shimmer even in the shade. She had traveled nearly 800 miles from Kansas City to marry Thomas Vaughn, a cattle rancher she had corresponded with for 14 months through letters that had grown increasingly affectionate, increasingly promising. Those letters had painted pictures of a strong, honorable man who loved the land, who spoke of building a life together with careful hope threaded through every word. The man at the altar looked exactly like the photograph Thomas had sent her, down to the strong jawline and the way his dark hair fell across his forehead. Yet Adelaide felt as though she were looking at a stranger wearing a familiar face. She walked down the aisle in her best dress, a modest cream-colored affair that her mother had helped her sew before she passed, 2 years prior. Her father held her arm, his grip perhaps a bit too tight, his weathered face creased with concern that he had tried to hide from her during their journey west. Adelaide had assured him she was certain about this marriage, about this man, about this life she was choosing. Women did not have unlimited choices in 1878, and Thomas Vaughn had seemed like a godsend when his first letter arrived in response to her carefully worded advertisement in the Kansas City paper. He wrote of his ranch in the Utah Territory, of red rock canyons and wide open spaces, of loneliness that echoed through empty rooms and the desire for a partner to share the burden and beauty of frontier life. Now, standing before this man who looked like Thomas, but somehow was not Thomas, Adelaide felt the first tremor of real fear. His eyes were the right color, that deep brown she had studied in the photograph until she had memorized every detail, but they held none of the warmth she had imagined would be there. They were cold, calculating, assessing her like a man might assess a horse he was considering purchasing. When he took her hand for the ceremony, his grip was too firm, almost painful, and she had to resist the urge to pull away. The Reverend, a kind-faced older man named Reverend Matthews, who had been serving the Mormon and Gentile populations of St. George for nearly a decade, began the ceremony. Adelaide heard the words as if from a great distance, her mind racing through everything she knew about Thomas Vaughn. He had written about his childhood in Virginia, about losing his family to fever when he was 17, about heading west to start over. He had described his love of early mornings, of watching the sun paint the red rocks gold and orange. He had shared his dreams of children, of a full table at Christmas, of growing old with someone who understood the harsh beauty of the desert. The man holding her hand said his vows in a voice that sounded right but felt wrong. Adelaide stumbled over her own responses, her tongue thick in her mouth. She saw her father shift uncomfortably in the front pew, saw the way his eyes narrowed as he studied the groom. Her father, Samuel Rivers, had been a lawman in Kansas before retiring, and he had instincts honed by years of reading people, of sensing when something was amiss. Adelaide could see those instincts screaming at him now, but what could either of them do? She had traveled all this way, had spent what little money she had on the journey, had burned her bridges back in Kansas City. This marriage was meant to be her salvation, her future. When the Reverend pronounced them man and wife, the groom kissed her, and Adelaide felt nothing but cold dread. His lips were hard against hers, possessive rather than affectionate. When he pulled back, she saw something flicker across his face, something that looked almost like triumph, and her blood turned to ice in her veins. The reception was held in the church's meeting hall, a simple affair with refreshments provided by the local women who had taken pity on the mail-order bride arriving to marry one of their community members. Adelaide moved through the motions of accepting congratulations, of smiling and thanking people whose names she could barely register. The man who was supposedly her husband kept his hand on her elbow, his grip tight enough to leave marks, steering her away whenever anyone tried to engage her in more than brief conversation. It was during this reception that Adelaide first saw him, the real him. Or at least, she thought later, the man who might have been the real him. He stood in the doorway of the hall, half hidden in shadow, and when their eyes met across the crowded room, Adelaide felt the world tilt on its axis. He looked exactly like the man she had just married, identical in every visible way, yet the expression on his face was entirely different. Where her new husband's eyes held cold calculation, this man's eyes held anguish and fury and something that looked like desperate hope. He took a step forward, his hand reaching out as if to stop something terrible from happening. And then her husband noticed the direction of her gaze and swung around. The man in the doorway vanished like smoke, and Adelaide was left wondering if she had imagined him, if the stress of the day and the journey and the wrongness of everything had conjured a phantom. Her husband's hand tightened painfully on her elbow, and when she looked at him, his face had gone white beneath his tan. "Who was that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "No one," he said curtly. "A drifter. This town is full of them." But Adelaide knew he was lying. She knew it in her bones, in the same deep place that had been screaming at her since she first saw him at the altar. That man in the doorway had been wearing range clothes similar to those her husband wore, and he had been looking at her with the kind of recognition that went far beyond a stranger's curiosity about a wedding celebration. The reception ended, and Adelaide found herself being led to a buckboard wagon by the man she had married. Her father hugged her tightly, and she felt him slip something into her pocket. "If you need anything, anything at all, you send word," he whispered into her ear. "I will be staying in town for a few more days before heading back to Kansas." His voice cracked on the last words, and Adelaide had to fight back tears as she watched him step away. He looked older suddenly, worn down by worry and the terrible helplessness of having to trust his daughter's fate to a man he clearly did not trust. The ranch was about 8 miles outside of St. George, accessible by a dusty road that wound through spectacular red rock formations. Under other circumstances, Adelaide would have been awed by the beauty of the landscape, by the way the evening light set the rocks ablaze with color, by the vast sky that seemed to stretch on forever. Instead, she sat rigid on the buckboard seat, acutely aware of the man beside her, of the gun he wore on his hip, of the isolation that awaited her. She thought of the man in the doorway, of those anguished eyes, and wondered what terrible thing had happened, what deception was unfolding around her. They arrived at the ranch as the sun was setting, painting long shadows across the yard. The house was larger than Adelaide had expected, a solid structure of adobe and wood that spoke of prosperity and permanence. There was a barn, corrals, and several outbuildings. She saw cattle in the distance, horses in the nearest corral. Under any other circumstances, she would have felt hope at the sight, would have imagined the life she could build here. Instead, she felt like a prisoner arriving at her cell. "Get inside," her husband said, his voice harsh. Gone was any pretense of civility, any attempt to play the part of the loving groom. Adelaide climbed down from the wagon on trembling legs and walked toward the house. Behind her, she heard him dealing with the horses, the everyday sounds of unhitching and leading animals to water somehow obscene in their normalcy when everything else was so horribly wrong. The inside of the house was well appointed, with furniture that spoke of care and investment. Adelaide saw touches that suggested a man who valued his home, who had prepared it for the arrival of a wife. There were curtains at the windows, good dishes in the kitchen cupboard, a quilt on the bed in the main bedroom that had been carefully stitched. All of these details made the situation even more confusing, even more frightening. Why would a man go to such lengths of deception if he had already built a life suitable for a bride? Her husband entered the house and locked the door behind him, pocketing the key. Adelaide's heart began to race. "Why did you lock the door?" she asked, proud that her voice did not shake. "Because you are going to listen to me, and you are going to understand how things are going to work," he said, moving closer to her. "My name is Timothy Vaughn, and yes, I know what you are thinking. Thomas was supposed to marry you. Thomas was supposed to be the one standing at that altar. But Thomas is weak, always has been. He did not have the stomach for what needed to be done." Adelaide backed away from him until she hit the wall. "What are you talking about? What have you done with Thomas?" Timothy laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Thomas is fine, or he will be as long as he stays away from what is mine. This ranch, this land, this life, it should have been mine from the beginning. Our father left it to Thomas because he was born 12 minutes earlier, 12 minutes that determined everything. I have worked this land just as hard as Thomas, harder even, but it was his name on the deed. So I made sure things were corrected." "You are his twin brother," Adelaide said, understanding flooding through her in a sickening wave. "You took his place." "Very astute," Timothy said, his tone mocking. "Yes, I am his twin. Yes, I took his place at the altar. And yes, you are now legally married to me, Mrs. Vaughn." The Reverend did not know the difference. No one knew the difference. Even your father, with his lawman instincts, was not certain, and now it is done, legally and properly done. This ranch is mine, you are mine, and Thomas can go to hell. Adelaide felt bile rise in her throat. "Where is he?" "Where is Thomas?" "Somewhere safe, where he cannot interfere," Timothy said dismissively. "He will not trouble us. Now, you are going to be a good wife, Adelaide. You are going to help me run this ranch, and you are going to keep your mouth shut about any suspicions you might have. If you try to run, if you try to tell anyone what you think you know, it will go very badly for you. Do you understand?" Adelaide said nothing, her mind racing through possibilities. She was married to this man in the eyes of the law and the church. Even if she told someone what had happened, who would believe her? Twin brothers, one impersonating the other. It sounded like something from a dime novel, too fantastic to be real, and she had no proof, nothing but her instincts and a fleeting glimpse of a man in a doorway. "I asked you a question," Timothy said, his voice dangerous. "I understand," Adelaide whispered, because she needed time, needed to think, needed to figure out what to do. "Good," Timothy said, some of the tension leaving his shoulders. "You will sleep in the spare room tonight. Tomorrow, we will begin to establish the proper routines of this household. You will cook, clean, and help with the ranch work as needed. You will present a happy front to anyone we encounter, and perhaps, in time, we will establish a more traditional marriage. But that will depend entirely on your behavior." He unlocked the door then, and Adelaide saw that he had never truly been concerned about her escaping. This house was 8 miles from town, in the middle of the desert, and she had nowhere to go and no one to turn to. She was trapped just as surely as if she were in a cell. Timothy showed her to a small bedroom off the kitchen, barely more than a closet with a narrow bed and a single window. "You will stay here tonight," he said. "Do not make me regret being merciful." After he left, locking her in from the outside, Adelaide sank onto the bed and allowed herself exactly 5 minutes to cry. Then she dried her tears, straightened her spine, and began to think. She was not a helpless child. She had survived her mother's death, her family's financial struggles, the hardships of frontier life. She would survive this too, and she would find a way to make things right. The man in the doorway, the real Thomas Vaughn, was out there somewhere. She had seen the anguish in his eyes, the desperate need to stop what was happening. He was not dead, despite what his brother implied. He was alive, and if she could find him, if she could reach him, perhaps together they could undo this terrible fraud. Adelaide examined the window in her room. It was small, but not impossibly so. She could fit through it if necessary, though climbing out would be difficult and would make considerable noise. She tested the lock on the door quietly and found it solid. Timothy might be mad, might be cruel, but he was not stupid. He had planned this carefully, had thought through the details. But every plan had weaknesses, and Adelaide was determined to find them. She did not sleep that night, instead lying awake and listening to the sounds of the house. She heard Timothy moving around, heard him eventually retire to what must be the master bedroom. She heard the normal sounds of the desert night through her window. Coyotes calling, the wind rustling through sage, the distant lowing of cattle. She thought about her father, probably lying awake in his hotel room in St. George, worried sick about her. She thought about Thomas Vaughn wherever he was and hoped he was safe. She thought about the letters she had received, those careful, kind, hopeful letters, and wondered how many had truly been written by Thomas, and how many had been intercepted or forged by Timothy. Morning came with the harsh light of the desert sun, and Adelaide heard Timothy unlocking her door. "Get up and make breakfast," he ordered. "There is work to be done today, and I expect you to pull your weight." Adelaide rose, smoothed her wrinkled dress, and followed him to the kitchen. She found supplies in the cupboards and set about making coffee and breakfast. Her hands moved automatically through the familiar tasks, while her mind continued to work through possibilities. She needed information. She needed to understand the full scope of what had happened, and she needed to find Thomas. Timothy ate his breakfast in silence, watching her with those cold eyes. When he finished, he said, "I have to ride out to check on the herd in the south pasture. You will stay here and clean the house. Do not attempt to leave. The ranch hands know to report anything unusual to me, and they are loyal to me, not to Thomas. If you try anything foolish, you will regret it." After he left, Adelaide immediately began to explore the house more thoroughly. She found Thomas's room, or what had been Thomas's room before Timothy took it over. It was clear that two men had been living in this house, clear that Timothy had not been exaggerating about working the ranch alongside his brother. She found papers in a desk drawer, legal documents that showed the ranch had indeed been left to Thomas Vaughn by their father, Jacob Vaughn, who had died 3 years earlier. She found letters, including some in her own handwriting, that had been opened and read. Her skin crawled at the thought of Timothy reading her private words to Thomas, of him using that information to craft his own responses. She found a photograph, tucked into the back of a drawer as if someone had hidden it hastily. It showed two young men, clearly twins, standing side by side. They were perhaps 18 or 19 years old, and while they looked nearly identical, Adelaide could see subtle differences now that she knew to look. Thomas, identified by a note on the back of the photograph, had a softer expression, kinder eyes. Timothy, even then, had something harder about him, something hungrier. The photograph was dated 1870, 8 years earlier, and had been taken in Virginia before they headed west. Adelaide was replacing the photograph when she heard horses approaching. She quickly returned everything to how she had found it and moved to the front window. 3 men were riding into the yard, ranch hands by the look of them. Her heart sank. If they were loyal to Timothy, as he had claimed, then they represented another layer of her prison. but she moved to the door anyway and opened it, stepping out onto the porch to greet them. The three men dismounted, and the oldest of them, a grizzled man in his 50s with a weathered face and kind eyes, removed his hat. "Good morning, madam," he said politely. "We heard Mr. Vaughn got himself married yesterday. We wanted to come by and offer our congratulations." "Thank you," Adelaide said carefully, studying the three men. The older man seemed genuine in his friendliness. The other two were younger, perhaps in their 20s, and they seemed uncertain, almost nervous. "I am Adelaide Vaughn. Pleased to meet you, madam. I am John Cooper, the foreman here. These are my nephews, Daniel and Michael Cooper. We have been working the Vaughn ranch for near about 3 years now. 3 years. That meant they had worked for both brothers, had known both Thomas and Timothy. Adelaide made a quick decision. "Mr. Cooper, may I ask you something? It might seem like an odd question." John Cooper's eyes sharpened slightly, and she saw intelligence there, saw a man who noticed things. "You can ask me anything you like, madam." "Did you attend the wedding yesterday?" "No, madam. We were not invited. Mr. Vaughn said it was to be a small affair, just family and the reverend. Said we could meet you today instead." "Which Mr. Vaughn told you that?" Adelaide asked carefully. The silence that followed her question was profound. John Cooper exchanged glances with his nephews, and Adelaide saw understanding dawn on his face. "What exactly are you asking, madam?" Adelaide took a breath. This was a risk, possibly a terrible one, but she had to try. "I am asking if you know where Thomas Vaughn is." The shock on John Cooper's face was answer enough. "You are married to Thomas Vaughn, madam. He is out checking the south pasture right now." "No," Adelaide said firmly. "I am married to Timothy Vaughn, though I did not know it at the time. He took his brother's place at the altar. I only realized something was wrong after the ceremony was completed. I saw Thomas yesterday, briefly, at the reception. He was in the doorway of the church hall. And then he vanished, and Timothy implied he had done something to ensure Thomas could not interfere with his plans." John Cooper's face went through a series of expressions: disbelief, shock, dawning horror, and finally, fury. "That son of a—" He cut himself off, remembering he was speaking to a lady. "Begging your pardon, madam, but if what you are saying is true, this is a serious matter. Timothy and Thomas have had their differences, always have, but I never thought Timothy would go this far. You believe me?" Adelaide asked, hardly daring to hope. "Madam, I have worked for both of those boys long enough to know their characters. Thomas is a good man, fair and honest. Timothy is—" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Timothy has always felt he got a raw deal, always resented that the ranch went to Thomas. And there is something about your story that rings true. Thomas was excited about your arrival, talked about it constantly. He had been preparing for weeks. Then 3 days ago he vanished. Timothy said Thomas had gone to check on some property up north, said he would be back in a week or so. I thought it was strange, Thomas leaving right before his bride arrived, but Timothy seemed confident everything was under control." 3 days ago, Adelaide repeated. "So Thomas has been gone for 3 days. Do you have any idea where Timothy might have taken him?" John Cooper thought hard. "There is an old line shack up in the hills about 15 miles northeast of here. It is remote, has not been used in a couple years. If I were going to hide someone, that is where I might do it." Adelaide felt hope surge through her. "Would you help me? Would you help me find Thomas and expose what Timothy has done?" John Cooper looked at his nephews, then back at Adelaide. "Madam, there is nothing I would like better. But we have to be smart about this. Timothy is dangerous when cornered, and he has always been faster with a gun than Thomas. We need a plan." Before they could discuss further, they heard a horse approaching at speed. Timothy came riding into the yard, and his face darkened when he saw Adelaide talking with the ranch hands. He dismounted quickly and strode over to them. "What is going on here?" he demanded. "Just meeting your wife, boss," John Cooper said smoothly, his manner shifting to casual deference so quickly that Adelaide almost missed the change. "Wanted to offer our congratulations proper-like." Timothy studied them all with suspicion, but he could find nothing obviously wrong with the scene. "Fine, you have met her, now get back to work. There are fences that need mending in the north pasture." "Yes, sir," John Cooper said, tipping his hat to Adelaide. But as he turned to leave, he met her eyes for just a moment, and she saw the promise there. He would help her. She was not alone. The rest of that day passed in tense silence. Timothy watched Adelaide like a hawk, clearly suspicious that she had said something to the ranch hands. But Adelaide played the part of the obedient wife, cooking dinner, cleaning, responding to his questions with meek compliance. Inside, her mind was racing. She needed to get to that line shack, needed to find out if Thomas was truly there. But how could she manage it when Timothy was watching her so closely? The answer came that night. Timothy had been drinking whiskey after dinner, and Adelaide could see the alcohol affecting him. His eyes grew heavy, his movements slower. She had been careful to be especially compliant all evening, had brought him his drink without being asked, had played the perfect picture of a subdued wife. When he finally stumbled off to bed, Adelaide waited in her locked room for what felt like hours. She listened for his snoring, for the sounds that would indicate he was deeply asleep. Finally, she could wait no longer. The window in her room was small, but she was slender and desperate. She pushed it open as quietly as she could, cringing at every small sound. The frame was just wide enough for her to squeeze through if she turned sideways. She had found a split riding skirt in a trunk in Thomas's room, something that had perhaps belonged to his mother, and she had changed into it earlier, knowing she could not ride in her dress. Now she wiggled through the window, dropping to the ground outside with a soft thud that sounded impossibly loud in the quiet night. She waited, frozen, listening for any sound from inside the house. Nothing. Timothy's snoring continued undisturbed. Adelaide crept toward the barn, moving as quietly as she could across the yard. The moon was 3/4 full, providing enough light to see by, and for that she was grateful. In the barn, the horses stirred at her entrance, but they were calm, accustomed to human presence. Adelaide found a gentle-looking mare and began to saddle her, her hands shaking with nerves and adrenaline. She had learned to ride as a child, though it had been some time since she had been on a horse. She hoped the skill would come back to her. Need some help with that. Adelaide spun around with a gasp, her heart leaping into her throat. A man stepped out of the shadows of the barn, and even in the dim light she recognized him. It was the man from the doorway, the man with Thomas's face but different eyes. It was Thomas himself. "You," she breathed. "You are alive. You are here." "I am alive and I am here," Thomas confirmed, moving closer. Up close, Adelaide could see the differences between him and his twin more clearly. Thomas's face was bruised, a dark mark along his jaw suggesting he had been hit recently. His clothes were disheveled and he looked exhausted, but his eyes were warm and alive and filled with the kind of concern that his brothers had lacked. "And you are Adelaide Rivers, the woman I was supposed to marry, the woman my brother stole from me. How did you get here?" "Your brother said he had you hidden somewhere, that you could not interfere." Thomas's expression darkened. "Timothy did have me locked up in an old line shack up in the hills. He came to me 3 days ago and said he needed my help with something urgent. Fool that I was, I went with him. He knocked me unconscious, and when I woke up, I was locked in that shack. He told me what he planned to do, told me he was going to take my place at the wedding, that he was going to take the life that should have been his. I tried to break out, tried everything, but he had me chained like an animal. Thomas's voice shook with remembered rage and humiliation. Finally, this evening, I managed to break the chain. It took me hours, and I tore my wrists to hell doing it. He held up his hands, and Adelaide saw the raw, bloody marks around his wrists where he had struggled against his bonds. I rode straight here as fast as I could. I saw you yesterday, Adelaide said. At the reception, you were in the doorway. Thomas nodded. I had managed to get one hand free by then. I broke out and rode here, but I was too late. The ceremony was already done. I saw you through the window, saw you standing next to him, and I knew I had lost everything. I wanted to burst in to stop it all, but what good would that have done? The marriage was already legal. You were already his wife in the eyes of the law and God. So what do we do? Adelaide asked, her voice breaking. I am married to your brother, but I do not want to be. I came here to marry you, Thomas. The man in those letters, the man who wrote about red rock sunrises and hopes for the future that was you, was it not? Every word, Thomas said softly. Adelaide, I know we have never truly met until this moment, but I have felt like I knew you for months now. Your letters were the brightest part of my days. The thought of marrying you, of building a life with you, was the only thing that made the loneliness of this place bearable, and Timothy took that from both of us. Adelaide felt tears prick her eyes. There has to be a way to fix this. There has to be some way to undo what he has done. There might be, Thomas said slowly. If we can prove fraud, if we can prove that Timothy impersonated me deliberately to enter into a false marriage, the marriage could be annulled. But we would need proof, and we would need witnesses willing to testify. It would be his word against ours, and he has been very clever. He made sure no one who knew both of us well was at the ceremony. John Cooper believes me, Adelaide said quickly. He and his nephews came by today. I told them what happened, and John said he would help. Hope flared in Thomas's eyes. John is a good man, and his word carries weight in St. George. If he will testify to our characters, to the differences between Timothy and me, that might be enough. But we need more. We need to get you away from here first, get you somewhere safe. Then we can build our case. My father is still in town, Adelaide said. He is staying at the hotel for a few more days. He did not trust Timothy, I could tell. If I could get to him, then let us go now, Thomas said firmly. My brother is dangerous, Adelaide. I do not want to leave you here a moment longer than necessary. Can you ride? Yes, Adelaide said, though she was not entirely certain that was true, but she would learn quickly if she had to. Thomas helped her finish saddling the mare, then quickly prepared a horse for himself. They led the horses out of the barn as quietly as possible, and Adelaide's heart hammered in her chest with every step. They were just mounting when they heard a shout from the house. Adelaide. Adelaide, where are you? Timothy had woken up. Adelaide saw lamplight flare in the house, saw his silhouette appear at the window of her room. They had seconds at most. Ride, Thomas shouted, and they kicked their horses into motion. Adelaide clung to the saddle as her mare leaped forward, following Thomas's horse as they raced out of the yard and onto the road toward St. George. Behind them, she heard more shouting, heard the sound of Timothy crashing through the house. Then she heard the unmistakable sound of a gunshot, and she ducked instinctively, though the bullet went wide. Keep riding, Thomas called back to her. He will come after us, but we have a head start. The 8 miles to St. George had never seemed longer. Adelaide's entire world narrowed to the horse beneath her, the road ahead lit by moonlight, and Thomas riding just ahead of her. She heard pursuit behind them, heard another gunshot that was closer this time. Her mare was fast, but Adelaide was not an experienced rider, and she could feel herself slipping in the saddle, could feel her grip weakening. Thomas glanced back and saw her struggling. He slowed slightly, letting her catch up. "You are doing great," he called to her. "Just hold on a little longer. The town is just ahead." And indeed, Adelaide could see lights in the distance now, the scattered buildings of St. George. Hope surged through her, giving her strength. They raced into the town's main street, and Thomas led them directly to the hotel where Adelaide's father was staying. They dismounted in a scramble, and Thomas pounded on the door. "Samuel Rivers. Mr. Rivers, please, we need your help." A window opened above them, and Adelaide's father stuck his head out, his hair mussed from sleep, a pistol in his hand. "Adelaide, what in God's name, Father, please let us in. Timothy is coming and he is armed." Samuel Rivers did not ask questions. He disappeared from the window and moments later appeared at the front door, hastily dressed and still holding his pistol. "Inside, quickly." They had barely gotten through the door when Timothy came racing up the street on his horse. He dismounted and strode toward the hotel, and Adelaide could see the fury on his face even in the dim light from the hotel's windows. "Adelaide," he shouted. "Adelaide, you come out here right now. You are my wife, and you belong at home with me." Samuel Rivers stepped out onto the porch, his pistol held casually but unmistakably in his hand. "I think that is close enough, Vaughn." Timothy stopped, his hand hovering near his own gun. "This is between me and my wife, Rivers. You have no part in this." "That is where you are wrong," Samuel said coldly. "That is my daughter you are talking about, and if you think I am going to let you drag her off after she came running into town in the middle of the night looking terrified, you have another thing coming." Timothy's eyes flickered to Thomas, who had stepped out onto the porch beside Adelaide. "Thomas," he spat, "I should have made sure you could not get free." "You should have left well enough alone," Thomas replied quietly. "You had half the ranch, Timothy. We were partners." "That should have been enough." "Half," Timothy said bitterly. "Half of what should have been all mine. Father left you the ranch, left you the house, left you everything that mattered because you were born first. 12 minutes, Thomas. That is all that separated us, and yet it determined everything. I worked just as hard as you, loved this land just as much, but it was your name on the deed. So yes, I took what should have been mine. I took the ranch, and I took your bride, and it should have worked if you had not been so stubborn about breaking free." "You committed fraud," Adelaide said, finding her voice. "You impersonated your brother to trick me into marriage. That marriage is not legal." "Prove it," Timothy said with a cold smile. "You married Thomas Vaughn in front of a reverend and witnesses. I am Thomas Vaughn. Who is to say otherwise? My brother who is jealous and wants to steal my wife. Good luck with that." "I am not your wife," Adelaide said firmly. "I never was and never will be." Timothy's hand moved toward his gun, and Samuel Rivers immediately raised his pistol. "Do not even think about it, boy. I might be retired, but I can still shoot faster and straighter than you on your best day." The standoff might have continued indefinitely, but at that moment, the sheriff of St. George, a lean, weathered man named Hugh Davidson, came walking up the street, drawn by the commotion. "What is going on here?" he demanded. "It is the middle of the night. People are trying to sleep." Samuel Rivers lowered his gun slightly but did not put it away. "Sheriff Davidson, I am glad you are here. This situation requires the law." Over the next hour, the entire story came out. They gathered in the sheriff's office, all 5 of them: Adelaide, Thomas, Timothy, Samuel, and the sheriff. Adelaide and Thomas told their version of events, describing the switched identities, the locked room, the imprisonment in the line shack. Timothy told his own story, claiming that Thomas was the imposter, that he was insane with jealousy and had convinced Adelaide to run away with him. It was, as Thomas had predicted, a matter of conflicting stories with little proof on either side. Sheriff Davidson listened to everything, his expression growing more troubled by the minute. Finally, he held up his hand for silence. "This is the damnedest thing I have heard in my 20 years of law enforcement," he said. "Twin brothers, switched identities, a mail-order bride caught in the middle. I do not mind telling you all that I have no idea how to sort this out legally, but I will tell you what I do know. I have known the Vaughn brothers for 3 years, and while I cannot always tell them apart by looks, I can tell them apart by character. Thomas Vaughn has always been honest, fair, and level-headed. Timothy Vaughn has always been bitter, angry, and prone to causing trouble. So when I have to decide which of you to believe, I know where my instincts lie." Timothy's face darkened with fury. "Your instincts are not evidence, Sheriff." "No, but they are good enough to make me want to investigate further. Thomas, you said Timothy locked you in the old line shack. Is there evidence of that? Chains, signs of your imprisonment?" "Yes," Thomas said quickly. "I left everything as it was when I broke free. The chains are still attached to the wall, and you will find my blood on them where I tore my wrists trying to get free." "That could be faked," Timothy protested. "Could it?" Sheriff Davidson said mildly. "Show me your wrists, both of you." Thomas held out his hands, showing the raw, bloody wounds that circled his wrists. Timothy hesitated, then held out his own hands. They were unmarked, calloused from ranch work but without any recent injuries. "Interesting," the sheriff said. "Thomas, is there anything else that might prove your identity? Something only the real Thomas would know." Thomas thought hard. "There is a scar on my right shoulder blade from when I was thrown from a horse when I was 16. Timothy does not have that scar. Strip off your shirts, both of you." Both men complied, and Adelaide looked away out of modesty, but she heard Samuel's grunt of confirmation. "Thomas has the scar. Timothy does not." "That proves nothing," Timothy said desperately. "So Thomas has a scar I do not have. That does not prove he is the one who was supposed to marry her." "Actually, it proves quite a bit," Sheriff Davidson said. "Because if you were the one who corresponded with Miss Rivers, if you were the one planning to marry her, why would she not know about your scars and your brother's lack of them? Why would Thomas know intimate details about his own body that you are trying to deny? And most tellingly, why did you not think to mention this scar when you were claiming to be Thomas?" Timothy had no answer to that. His face was white, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. "This is not fair," he said, his voice breaking. "None of this is fair. I worked just as hard as he did. I deserved a life too." "You did deserve a life," Thomas said quietly, "and you had one. We were partners, Timothy. You had half of everything, and you had my respect and my affection as my brother. But that was not enough for you. It never would have been enough. You did not want a life of your own. You wanted my life, and you were willing to destroy everything to take it." "What happens now?" Adelaide asked the sheriff. Sheriff Davidson sighed. "Well, that is complicated. The marriage is clearly fraudulent, obtained through impersonation and deceit. I believe we can get it annulled on those grounds, but we will need to bring it before a judge. Judge Harmon will be coming through St. George in about 2 weeks. In the meantime, Timothy, I am placing you under arrest for fraud and unlawful imprisonment. Thomas, I am releasing the ranch back into your custody as the rightful heir. Miss Rivers, or I suppose it is Mrs. Vaughn, though not for much longer, you will need to remain in town until the judge arrives to hear your testimony." "She can stay with me," Samuel Rivers said firmly. "I was planning to stay a few more days anyway. Now I will stay as long as necessary." Over the next 2 weeks, St. George buzzed with gossip about the Vaughn twins and the switched bride scandal. Adelaide stayed in the hotel with her father, grateful for his solid, dependable presence. Thomas visited daily, and Adelaide found herself looking forward to those visits with an intensity that surprised her. They would sit in the hotel's modest parlor and talk, really talk, in a way that felt like a continuation of their letters but deeper, more real. They discovered that the connection they had built through correspondence was only strengthened by physical presence. Thomas was everything his letters had suggested: kind, thoughtful, with a dry sense of humor and a genuine love for the land he called home. John Cooper and his nephews came to town to give statements supporting Thomas's version of events. Other townspeople who had known both brothers also came forward, all testifying to the differences in the twins' characters. The case against Timothy became stronger and stronger, until even he had to acknowledge that he had no chance of maintaining his deception. When Judge Harmon finally arrived, the hearing was brief. The judge listened to all the testimony, examined the evidence, and ruled that the marriage between Timothy Vaughn and Adelaide Rivers was null and void, obtained through fraudulent means. He sentenced Timothy to 6 months in the territorial prison for fraud and unlawful imprisonment, and he ordered him to sign over his share of the ranch to Thomas, given that he had attempted to steal it through deception. It was a harsh sentence, but the judge was clear that such blatant fraud could not be tolerated. After the hearing, Thomas found Adelaide standing outside the courthouse, looking out at the red rocks in the distance. He came to stand beside her, not touching but close enough that she could feel the warmth of his presence. "It is over," he said quietly. "You are free now, Adelaide. Free to go back to Kansas if you want, free to do whatever you choose." Adelaide turned to look at him, this man who had been through so much, who had lost his bride and nearly his life to his brother's ambitions. "What if I do not want to go back to Kansas?" she asked softly. "What if the life I came here to find is still the life I want?" Hope flickered across Thomas's face, but he was careful, respectful. "Adelaide, you came here expecting to marry me, but we met under the worst possible circumstances. You have every right to change your mind, to decide this is not the life you want after all. I would not blame you." "Let me ask you something," Adelaide said. "Those letters you wrote to me, the feelings you expressed, were they real?" "Every word," Thomas said fervently. "Adelaide, I have been in love with you since your 3rd letter, when you told me about your mother's death and how you were trying to be strong for your father. I fell in love with your courage, your humor, your kindness. Meeting you in person has only deepened those feelings. But I understand if you need time, if you need to be sure this is what you really want." "I am sure," Adelaide said simply. "Thomas, I came here to marry you, to build a life with you, and that is still what I want. What your brother did was terrible, but in a strange way, it showed me the difference between you. Timothy took without asking, manipulated and controlled. You have been patient, respectful, giving me the choice even when you were hurt and angry and had every right to demand something from me. That tells me everything I need to know about your character." "Are you saying you still want to marry me?" Thomas asked, his voice thick with emotion. "I am saying exactly that," Adelaide confirmed. "If you still want to marry me." Thomas's answer was to take her hands gently in his, mindful of the fading wounds on his wrists. "Adelaide Rivers, I would be honored and grateful to marry you, to spend my life with you, to build all those dreams we wrote about in our letters. I promise you, I will spend every day trying to make you happy, trying to be worthy of the trust you are placing in me." "You already are worthy," Adelaide said softly. "You have been from the beginning." They were married 3 days later, in the same church where Adelaide had married Timothy, but this time everything was right. Her father walked her down the aisle again, but this time he was smiling, relieved and happy for his daughter. Reverend Matthews performed the ceremony, apologizing profusely for not having noticed the switch the first time. The church was full of well-wishers, including John Cooper and his nephews, Sheriff Davidson, and what seemed like half the town of St. George, all of whom had followed the scandal with interest and wanted to see it end happily. When Thomas kissed Adelaide this time, it was gentle and sweet and full of promise. She felt warmth spread through her, felt the rightness of this moment, this man, this life she was choosing. When they turned to face the congregation as husband and wife, the applause was thunderous. The reception was held at the hotel, a much larger and happier affair than the first had been. Adelaide found herself laughing more than she had in months, surrounded by people who wished her well, married to a man who looked at her like she was the most precious thing in the world. Samuel Rivers pulled her aside at one point, his eyes misty. "Your mother would have been so happy to see this," he said. "To see you happy with a good man who will treat you right. I can go back to Kansas now knowing you are in good hands." "Thank you for staying, Father," Adelaide said, hugging him tightly. "Thank you for believing me, for protecting me, for being here." "Always," Samuel said simply. "You are my daughter. I will always be here for you, no matter how many miles lie between us." Thomas and Adelaide spent their wedding night at the ranch, the home that was now truly theirs together. Thomas carried her over the threshold, and Adelaide laughed at the old-fashioned gesture. "Welcome home, Mrs. Vaughn," Thomas said, setting her down gently in the front room. "The real Mrs. Vaughn this time." "I like the sound of that," Adelaide said. She looked around the house, seeing it with new eyes. It was a good house, solid and well-built, and now it was hers. Now she could make it a home. "Thomas, can I ask you something?" "Anything," he said. "What are you going to do about Timothy? When he is released from prison, I mean." This was his home, too, for years. "What happens then?" Thomas sighed, his expression becoming troubled. "I have thought about that a lot over the past few weeks. Timothy is my brother, despite everything. We shared a womb, grew up together, faced the world together after our parents died. What he did was wrong, terribly wrong, but I cannot help feeling like I failed him somehow, like maybe if I had been more generous, more understanding, things might have turned out differently." "This was not your fault," Adelaide said firmly. "Thomas, you gave Timothy half of everything. You treated him as an equal partner. His bitterness, his sense of entitlement, those were his choices, not yours." "I know that in my head," Thomas said, "but in my heart I still grieve for the brother I thought I knew, the brother I loved. When Timothy is released, I am going to give him some money, enough to start over somewhere else if he wants. But he cannot come back here. I cannot trust him, and I will not put you at risk by allowing him near you again. Maybe that makes me a bad brother, but I have to protect my wife, my future. You come first now, Adelaide, above everything else." Adelaide went to him and wrapped her arms around his waist, resting her head against his chest. "You are not a bad brother. You are a good man trying to navigate an impossible situation. Whatever you decide, I will support you." They stood like that for a long moment, holding each other in the quiet house. Then Thomas tilted Adelaide's face up to his and kissed her, deeper this time, with a passion that made her heart race. "I love you," he whispered against her lips. "I know it is fast. I know we barely know each other in some ways, but I love you, Adelaide. I think I have loved you for months, through your letters, through your courage, through everything." "I love you too," Adelaide whispered back. "I think I have been waiting for you my whole life without knowing it, and now I have found you, and I am not letting go." Their wedding night was everything their first night should have been, tender and passionate and full of promises for the future. Thomas was gentle and patient, and Adelaide felt herself falling even more deeply in love with this man who had somehow become hers. When they finally slept, wrapped in each other's arms, Adelaide felt a peace she had not known since before her mother's death. She was home. She was loved. She was exactly where she was meant to be. The months that followed were busy ones. Adelaide threw herself into making the ranch a true home, into learning all the skills she would need as a rancher's wife. She learned to cook for ranch hands, to preserve food for winter, to help with the animals when necessary. She learned the rhythms of the ranch, the early mornings and long days, the satisfaction of hard work and visible results. Thomas taught her to ride properly, and they would often take evening rides together, watching the sun set over the red rocks, talking about their days and their dreams. John Cooper and his nephews became good friends, and Adelaide came to appreciate their loyalty and hard work. She learned that John had lost his own wife some years back and had been raising his nephews alone. She made sure to include them in family dinners, to treat them as extended family rather than just employees. The ranch began to feel less like a business and more like a community, a family. Samuel Rivers visited once before returning to Kansas, staying for a week to assure himself that Adelaide was truly happy and settled. He and Thomas developed a genuine friendship, and Samuel gave Thomas his blessing with tears in his eyes. "Take care of her," he said simply. "She is all I have left of her mother." "I will guard her with my life," Thomas promised, and Samuel believed him. Letters arrived sporadically from Kansas, from friends Adelaide had left behind, and she wrote back with stories of her new life, her happy marriage, the beauty of the Utah Territory. She sent photographs when a traveling photographer came through St. George, showing her father and friends the life she was building. In turn, she received news from home, marriages and births and deaths, the small dramas of the life she had left behind. She missed Kansas sometimes, missed the familiar, but she never regretted her choice to come west. 6 months after the wedding, Timothy was released from prison. Thomas received word and immediately rode to the prison to meet his brother. He returned home late that night, looking exhausted and sad. Adelaide met him at the door, and he held her tightly for a long moment before speaking. "I gave him $500 and told him to start over somewhere else," he said quietly. "I told him I forgave him, but that he could never come back here, could never contact us again. He took the money and left without saying a word. I do not know if I will ever see him again." "I am sorry," Adelaide said, and she meant it. She knew Thomas had hoped for some reconciliation, some sign that his brother regretted his actions. "Are you all right?" "I will be," Thomas said. "I have you, and I have this ranch, and I have a future to build. That is more than enough." They never heard from Timothy again. Years later, they received word through a mutual acquaintance that he had gone to California and made a new life for himself, that he had eventually married and settled down. Thomas was glad to hear his brother had found some peace, but he never reached out, and Timothy never tried to contact them. Some wounds, they both understood, could not be healed with time alone. Life on the ranch continued its rhythms through the seasons. Adelaide learned that she loved the desert, loved the stark beauty of the red rocks and the vast open sky. She learned to read the weather, to understand the signs of rain or drought. She became involved in the community of St. George, helping with church socials and community events. She made friends among the women of the town, and they welcomed her warmly, treating her with respect rather than pity or curiosity once the scandal had faded into memory. In the spring of 1879, Adelaide discovered she was pregnant. Thomas was overjoyed, and Adelaide found herself equal parts excited and terrified. Childbirth on the frontier was dangerous, and the nearest doctor was in St. George, 8 miles away. But she had the support of the ranch women, who promised to help when her time came, and she had Thomas, who doted on her so thoroughly that she finally had to tell him to stop treating her like spun glass. Their daughter was born on a warm October morning, a lusty, healthy baby with dark hair and her father's eyes. They named her Claire, after Adelaide's mother, and Thomas cried when he held his daughter for the first time, this tiny, perfect person who represented everything good in his life. Adelaide, exhausted but elated, watched her husband cradle their child and felt her heart swell with a love so fierce it was almost painful. Claire was followed by a son 2 years later, whom they named Samuel after Adelaide's father. Samuel Rivers made the journey from Kansas to meet his grandson, and the visit was a joyous one, full of laughter and stories, and the satisfaction of seeing his daughter thriving. He stayed for a month, delighting in his grandchildren and in seeing Adelaide so clearly happy and fulfilled. The ranch prospered under Thomas's management. He was a fair employer and a shrewd businessman, and he expanded the herd steadily, always reinvesting profits into improvements. He built a new barn, repaired and expanded the house, drilled a new well. Adelaide worked alongside him when she could, and together they built something lasting, something to pass on to their children and their children's children. Years passed in the way they do, marked by births and deaths, good seasons and bad, the small victories and defeats that make up a life. Adelaide's father passed away peacefully in his sleep when Claire was 5 and Samuel was 3, and Adelaide grieved deeply for the loss of her last connection to her childhood. But she had Thomas and her children, and she had the life she had built in this desert country, and that sustained her through the grief. More children came. Another daughter named Hannah, then twins, boys they named Jacob and John after Thomas's father and the foreman who had helped them in their darkest hour. The house rang with the noise of children, and Adelaide often thought how different this was from the lonely mail-order bride who had arrived in St. George so many years ago. She had expected a marriage of convenience, a partnership based on mutual need and carefully constructed through letters. What she had received instead was a love story, messy and complicated and real, but ultimately more satisfying than anything she could have imagined. John Cooper remained foreman until he was too old to ride, and then his nephew Daniel took over the role, with Michael as his second. The Coopers became like family, their children growing up alongside the Vaughn children, all of them running wild through the red rocks and learning the ranching trade from the ground up. It was a good life, hard but good, and Adelaide never regretted her choice to stay, to build this life with Thomas. When they had been married for 20 years, Thomas surprised Adelaide with a photograph session. They gathered all 5 children, now ranging from 19 to 11, and had a formal family portrait taken by a photographer from Salt Lake City. In that photograph, Adelaide saw the life they had built reflected back at her. A strong, weathered rancher with silver threading through his dark hair, a woman no longer young but content and loved, and 5 healthy, happy children who knew nothing of the scandal that had marked their parents' early days. It was a portrait of a family that should not have existed, built on the ashes of deception and pain, but that had somehow become the most real and true thing Adelaide had ever known. On their 25th anniversary, Thomas took Adelaide back to St. George, to the little church where they had been married. It was evening and the church was empty except for them. They stood at the altar where they had made their vows, and Thomas took her hands. "Do you remember what I promised you?" he asked softly. "That I would spend every day trying to make you happy, trying to be worthy of your trust." "I remember," Adelaide said, smiling. "And you have kept that promise every single day." "I want to make another promise now," Thomas said. "For the next 25 years, and the 25 after that if God grants us the time. I promise to keep loving you, to keep building our life together, to keep being grateful every single day that you took a chance on a cowboy rancher with a crazy twin brother and more hope than sense." Adelaide laughed, and it was the laugh of a woman who had lived and loved well. "I promise the same thing," she said. "To keep loving you, to keep building our life together, to keep being grateful that I found the right Vaughn twin in the end." They renewed their vows that evening, just the two of them and God, and when they left the church, Adelaide looked back at the building that had witnessed both the worst and best moments of her life in the Utah Territory. She thought about that scared young bride who had known something was wrong but had not known how to fix it. She thought about the imposter who had tried to steal a life that was not his. And she thought about the real Thomas, the man who had fought to reclaim what was his, and who had then spent 25 years proving every day that he had been worth fighting for. They walked hand in hand back to the hotel where they were staying for the night, a rare, overnight trip away from the ranch and the children. Tomorrow, they would return to their responsibilities, to the ranch that was their legacy and their livelihood. But tonight, they were just Thomas and Adelaide, two people who had found each other against all odds and had built a love that had weathered every storm. Years continued to pass. Their children grew up and started families of their own. Claire married a young rancher from Cedar City and moved there, though she visited often with her growing brood of children. Samuel took over more and more of the ranch operations, working side by side with his father and clearly being groomed to take over when Thomas was ready to step back. Hannah surprised everyone by becoming a teacher in St. George, a respected educator who never married but found fulfillment in teaching generations of children. The twins, Jacob and John, stayed on the ranch, both of them natural cowboys who loved the land as much as their father did. Adelaide became a grandmother many times over, and she threw herself into that role with joy. She taught her granddaughters to cook and sew, taught them the skills they would need as ranchers' wives. She told them stories of her own youth, of the journey west, of the strange circumstances of her marriage. She made sure they understood that life rarely went as planned, but that did not mean it could not be wonderful anyway. Thomas aged well, growing more distinguished with the years, his dark hair going silver and then white. He moved a bit slower, his joints stiffened by years of hard work and the dry desert climate, but his mind remained sharp, and his love for Adelaide only grew deeper. They fell into comfortable patterns, these two people who had grown old together, finishing each other's sentences and communicating whole conversations with just a look. They heard nothing more of Timothy over the years. He had vanished into the vastness of California, and whatever life he had built there, it remained separate from theirs. Thomas sometimes wondered about his twin, wondered if he had found happiness, or if the bitterness that had driven him to such desperate acts had poisoned whatever life he had tried to build. But these thoughts grew less frequent as the years passed, and eventually Timothy became just a shadow from the past, acknowledged but no longer dwelled upon. When Samuel Rivers Vaughn, their eldest son, married a lovely young woman named Margaret in 1900, Adelaide and Thomas stood together and watched their son begin his own family. They were in their 50s now, considered old by frontier standards, but still vital and engaged with life. At the reception, Margaret shyly asked Adelaide about how she and Thomas had met, and Adelaide told her the story, the whole strange, complicated, wonderful story. Margaret listened with wide eyes, and when Adelaide finished, the young woman said, "That is the most romantic thing I have ever heard." Adelaide laughed. "It did not feel romantic at the time," she said. "It felt terrifying and confusing and wrong, but in the end it led me to exactly where I was meant to be." "How did you know?" Margaret asked. "How did you know Thomas was the right one?" Adelaide thought about that for a moment, looking across the room to where Thomas stood talking with their son. He felt her gaze and looked up, meeting her eyes and giving her that small, private smile that was only for her. "I knew because he gave me a choice," Adelaide said finally. "Even when he was hurt and angry and had every right to demand something from me, he gave me the freedom to choose. And I knew that any man who respected me that much, who valued my autonomy even in the worst of circumstances, was a man I could build a life with." The love came later, grew out of that respect and that choice, and it has kept growing every day since. As the new century dawned, Thomas and Adelaide began to step back from the day-to-day operations of the ranch. Samuel and his wife took over the main house, and Thomas built a smaller house on the property for himself and Adelaide, a cozy place with a view of the red rocks they both loved. They spent their days in gentle rhythms, visiting with grandchildren, reading, taking slow walks in the evening when the heat of the day had passed. It was a peaceful retirement, earned through years of hard work and sacrifice. On a warm spring evening in 1905, Thomas and Adelaide sat on the porch of their small house, watching the sun set over the landscape they had loved for nearly 3 decades. They were both in their early 60s now, and while their health was generally good, they felt the weight of years. Thomas reached over and took Adelaide's hand, lacing their fingers together in a gesture that had become as natural as breathing over the years. "You ever regret it?" he asked quietly. "Coming west, staying here, building this life with me instead of going back to Kansas?" Adelaide looked at him in surprise. "Not for one single second," she said firmly. "Thomas, this life with you has been the greatest adventure I could have imagined. We have built something real and lasting. We have raised 5 wonderful children who are now raising children of their own. We have loved each other through good times and bad, through droughts and disasters and everything in between. Why would I regret any of that?" "I just want to make sure," Thomas said, squeezing her hand. "I want to make sure that you are happy, that you feel like the life you gave up in Kansas was worth what you gained here." "I gained everything here," Adelaide said softly. "I gained love, a home, a family, a purpose. I became who I was meant to be. Kansas was my past, Thomas, but you are my present and my future. However much time we have left, whether it is days or years or decades, I want to spend all of it with you." Thomas brought her hand to his lips and kissed it gently. "I love you, Adelaide Vaughn. I have loved you since the day you took a chance on a cowboy who wrote you letters about red rock sunrises and hopes for the future. And I will love you until the day I die and beyond, if there is anything beyond." "I love you too," Adelaide whispered. "My real groom, my true love, my Thomas." They sat together as the stars came out. 2 people who had found each other through the strangest of circumstances and had built a love that would last the ages. Behind them, in the main house, they could hear the sounds of their grandchildren playing, the next generation carrying on the legacy they had built. Adelaide thought about that frightened bride who had stood at the altar 27 years ago, knowing something was wrong but not knowing how to fix it. She thought about the cowboy who had raced through the night to try to stop a fraud, who had lost everything and then fought to get it back. And she thought about how sometimes the worst moments of your life could lead to the best, how disaster could transform into destiny if you were brave enough to keep fighting for what was right. The years that followed were gentle ones. Thomas and Adelaide watched their children and grandchildren grow, watched the ranch continue to prosper under Samuel's management. They traveled a bit, taking a train trip to San Francisco that Adelaide had always dreamed of, visiting Claire in Cedar City regularly. They attended weddings and funerals, births and celebrations, all the milestones that mark a life well lived. Thomas began to slow down noticeably when he reached his 70th year. The years of hard labor had taken their toll, and while his mind remained sharp, his body was failing. Adelaide cared for him tenderly, just as he had cared for her through 5 pregnancies and countless illnesses over the years. They had always been partners, and now in their final years together, that partnership took on new dimensions of tenderness and care. On a cold January morning in 1913, Thomas Vaughn passed away peacefully in his sleep, Adelaide holding his hand. He was 73 years old, and he had lived a good life, a full life, a life marked by integrity and love. Adelaide grieved deeply for the loss of her husband, her partner, her truest friend. But she also felt profound gratitude for the 45 years they had shared, for every letter and every sunrise, every challenge overcome, and every joy celebrated together. She lived for another 7 years, surrounded by children and grandchildren who loved her dearly. She remained sharp and engaged until nearly the end, telling stories of the old days, of the Wild West that was rapidly vanishing into history. She told her favorite story often about the bride who found her groom was a twin imposter, and the cowboy who said, "Let me be the real one." She told it with humor and love, making it clear that while the beginning had been frightening, the ending had been perfect. Adelaide Rivers Vaughn died peacefully in her sleep on a warm June evening in 1920, surrounded by 3 generations of the family she and Thomas had created. She was 80 years old, and she had lived to see the Utah Territory become a state, to see the Wild West she had known transform into something more settled and civilized. But she never forgot those early days, the adventure and danger and passion of frontier life. And she never forgot the man who had loved her truly, who had fought for her, who had spent his life proving every day that he had been the right choice all along. They buried her next to Thomas in the small cemetery in St. George under a headstone that read, "Adelaide Rivers Vaughn, beloved wife, mother, and grandmother, she found her true love against all odds." And below that, Thomas's headstone, which read, "Thomas Vaughn, loving husband, father, and grandfather." He fought for what was right and won everything that mattered. Their children and grandchildren gathered for the funeral, and they told stories of Thomas and Adelaide, of their great love and the unusual circumstances of their meeting. The story became family legend, passed down through generations. The tale of the twin imposter and the real groom, of the bride who had to choose and the cowboy who had fought for his right to be chosen. It was a story of deception and truth, of evil and good, but most of all it was a story of love triumphant, of 2 people who had found each other against impossible odds and had built something beautiful and lasting. The ranch continued for generations, passed down from Samuel to his children and then to theirs. The house that Thomas built still stood, carefully maintained as a reminder of the family's history. In the main house, now over a century old, descendants of Thomas and Adelaide Vaughn still lived and worked, still watched the sun set over the red rocks, still felt connected to the legacy of those 2 people who had started it all so long ago. And in St. George, now a thriving city rather than a dusty frontier town, old-timers still told the story of the Vaughn twins and the mail-order bride, of the scandal that had rocked the community in 1878 and the love story that had emerged from the ashes. It had become part of local legend, embellished and romanticized over the years, but still fundamentally true. The bride found her groom was a twin imposter. The cowboy said, "Let me be the real one." And together they built a love that lasted through the ages and beyond, a testament to the power of truth, courage, and choosing love, even when every circumstance argued against it. Their story was complete, their ending perfect, their legacy secure. Thomas and Adelaide Vaughn had lived and loved and built something that would outlast them by generations. And in the end, that was all anyone could hope for. A life well lived, a love well cherished, and a legacy that would continue long after they were gone, reminding the world that even in the darkest moments, hope and love could prevail, and that sometimes the most unexpected circumstances could lead to the most extraordinary happiness.